He didn't flinch at the cold. He didn't flinch at the crowd. He didn't flinch at the size of the man in front of him. What made Alexei Volkov stop wasn't a punch. It wasn't a kick. It was 5 seconds of something he had never experienced in 14 years of fighting in Siberia's most brutal underground circuits. And those 5 seconds would be the most studied, most debated, most replicated moment in the history of Soviet martial arts. Novosibirsk, Siberia, USSR, January 1971. The temperature outside was -71°F, the kind of cold that freezes breath mid-air, that turns exposed skin white in under 2 minutes, that makes metal brittle and wood crack like glass. The city of Novosibirsk sat in the heart of western Siberia, the largest city east of the Ural Mountains, home to nearly 1 million people who had learned to live inside cold that the rest of the world could only imagine. Bruce Lee was not supposed to be in Novosibirsk. He had been invited to Moscow for a series of private martial arts seminars organized through diplomatic channels by a group of Soviet sports scientists who had become obsessed with his philosophy of Jeet Kune Do. They wanted to study his biomechanics, his neural efficiency, his concept of the intercepting fist. Soviet sports science was the most advanced in the world at the time, and they had heard about something they needed to understand for themselves. The Moscow seminars had gone exceptionally well. 3 days of demonstrations, training sessions, and philosophical discussions with some of the USSR's top combat researchers. On the final day, one of the scientists, a man named Dr. Oleg Petrov, made an unusual request. "There is someone in Novosibirsk who should meet you." He paused. "And who should meet you?" Bruce asked what he meant. Petrov chose his words carefully. "There is a man there who does not believe what we have told him. He believes strength is the only truth. He would benefit from a different truth." Bruce agreed to extend the trip. He had never been to Siberia. He was curious. The flight from Moscow to Novosibirsk took 4 hours. When the plane landed and the door opened, the cold hit Bruce like a physical object, something solid, something alive. His translator, a young Soviet linguist named Mikhail, who had been assigned to him for the entire visit, watched Bruce's reaction carefully. "Most visitors," Mikhail said, "turn around at the door. They see the temperature reading and they simply turn around." Bruce stepped onto the tarmac without a word. They drove 40 minutes from the airport through streets lined with concrete apartment buildings, their walls crusted with ice, smoke rising from every chimney in straight white columns against a sky the color of iron. The car heater was running at maximum capacity, and Bruce could still see his breath inside the vehicle. Mikhail apologized for the cold, somewhat embarrassed. "It is unusual even for us," he said. "The instruments at the meteorological station recorded -39°C this morning. That is -78°F." Bruce looked out the window at a city going about its business in temperatures that seemed incompatible with human life. People walking, people working, children even. "What does a person learn?" Bruce said quietly, more to himself than to Mikhail, about endurance from living in this every day. The venue was a sports complex in the Akademgorodok district, the academic city within the city, where the Soviet Union had concentrated its greatest scientific minds since the 1950s. The building was used for combat training by military personnel and civilian athletes alike. The interior was warmer than the outside, but not warm by any other standard. The concrete walls held cold the way they held sound, completely. Breath was still visible. The training floor was covered in canvas matting worn thin from years of use. Alexei Volkov was already there when Bruce arrived. He was always already there. That was one of the first things people said about him. He arrived before everyone else and left after everyone else. He had been doing this for 14 years. Volkov was 31 years old, 6 feet 6 inches tall, and weighed 293 pounds. Not the soft 293 of someone who had gained weight, but had done nothing with it. Every pound was trained, conditioned, tested. His shoulders were the width of a doorframe. His hands, when unclenched, looked like they had been designed for a different species. His knuckles were a geography of old scar tissue from years of iron post conditioning, a traditional training method that hardened the bones of the hands through sustained progressive impact against iron surfaces wrapped in rope. He had never lost a fight, not in regulated competition, Not in the underground circuits that operated in the industrial warehouses along the Ob River, where different rules applied or no rules applied at all. He had fought boxers, wrestlers, sambo practitioners, former military combatives instructors. He had fought men larger than himself, which was difficult to find, and men faster than himself, which was less difficult. He had always won. The Soviet Sports Institute had documented 29 consecutive victories. The underground circuit, which kept no official records, had seen considerably more. Volkov had heard about Bruce Lee from Petrov and the other scientists who had gone to Moscow. He had listened to their descriptions of what they had witnessed. Neural efficiency, they said. Whole body integration. Force redirection. Volkov had listened with the patience of a man who had heard many things claimed about many fighters. Then he had asked one question. How much does he weigh? 140 pounds, Petrov said. Volkov stood up and walked out of the room. That was 3 days ago. He had agreed to the meeting not because he had changed his mind, but because he respected Petrov and because he was genuinely curious, in the way that a mountain is curious about what the wind thinks of itself. His position was not arrogant in his own view. It was logical. Physics, as he understood it, did not negotiate. Mass times acceleration. Force. He had seen smaller men use technique to defeat larger men in competition, where rules constrained what could be done. But pure technique against pure strength, with nothing held back? He believed he knew how that ended. When Bruce walked into the training hall, the assembled group of scientists, coaches, and athletes went quiet in the specific way that silence communicates surprise. They had been told a martial artist was coming. They had expected someone with the bearing and size of a martial artist. What they saw was a compact man in a black training jacket and black pants, moving with a quality of attention that was difficult to name. He was smaller than some of their 14-year-old gymnasts. He looked around the room with eyes that took inventory without seeming to hurry. He noticed Volkov immediately. Mikhail made the introduction in Russian. Alexe Volkov. Undefeated. Champion of the Ob circuit, Soviet Sambo regional medalist. Volkov looked down at Bruce the way a man looks down at something he is trying to classify. He said something in Russian. Mikhail translated, his voice slightly uncertain. He says, "The scientist told me you could hurt me. He wants to know if you believe that yourself." Bruce met Volkov's gaze without adjusting his posture, without puffing himself up, without any of the physical theater that smaller men sometimes use to compensate for the visual disadvantage of the moment. "I don't know," Bruce said simply. "I've never hit you." Volkov found this answer interesting. He had expected confidence or humility, two performances he had seen many times in the moments before fights. He had not expected what sounded like genuine scientific honesty. He said something else. Mikhail translated. He says, "Other men who came here to demonstrate told me what they could do before they did it." He says, "You're the first who didn't." Bruce nodded. "Telling you what I can do doesn't demonstrate anything. Demonstration demonstrates." Volkov almost smiled. Not quite, but the muscles around his eyes changed slightly. He said, "Then demonstrate. Come. Hit me. I will stand still. Hit me as hard as you can." The room shifted. This was the challenge everyone had known was coming, but hearing it stated so plainly in that cold concrete space made it more real. The other men in the room moved back slightly without being conscious of doing so. Dr. Petrov, standing near the wall with a notepad, uncapped his pen. Mikhail looked at Bruce with an expression that asked, "How do you want me to translate your refusal?" Because Mikhail expected a refusal. What rational person accepts an invitation to punch a 293-pound man who has never been hurt in 14 years of fighting and is standing there inviting the impact with the calm certainty of someone who knows the outcome? Bruce said, "All right." This created a different kind of silence. Not the silence of surprise, but the silence of a room recalibrating itself around new information. Volkov's expression did not change. He planted his feet wider, a stance that communicated rootedness. He was not performing for the room. He was genuinely preparing to absorb whatever Bruce intended to deliver, as he had absorbed everything else in his career, through mass, through conditioning, through the simple physical fact that 293 pounds of trained body is an enormous amount of force to redirect. Bruce stood in front of Volkov and looked at him for a moment, not sizing him up in any conventional sense, reading him, sensing the weight distribution, the tension patterns in the shoulders, the particular way this man inhabited his own size. He had felt large opponents before. He had trained against people much bigger than himself throughout his entire career. Every training partner in America who had doubted him, every martial artist who had assumed size told the full story. He understood the geometry of large bodies. He understood where force accumulated and where it could be interrupted. He raised his right hand. Not in a martial arts ready position, not in a theatrical gesture. He simply raised it to the level of Volkov's sternum and looked at the spot. Volkov watched this with his arms hanging loosely at his sides, his chin slightly tucked, his body braced with the professional readiness of a man who had been hit by the strongest competitors in Siberia and found the experience manageable. He was ready. He was certain. He said in Russian without Mikhail translating. The room was close enough that everyone could hear and several understood. Don't hold back. Bruce didn't hold back. What happened in the next 5 seconds was documented in 3 separate written accounts by witnesses present that day, accounts that were not compared or coordinated because 2 were written in Russian and 1 in English by Dr. Petrov, who had learned English from American scientific journals. All 3 accounts describe the same sequence. The sound came first. Not the sound of impact, which everyone expected, but a sound that preceded it. A sharp compression of air that Petrov described as similar to the sound a wet towel makes when snapped hard. This was the release of Bruce's strike, the 1-inch punch, the technique he had developed and refined for years, the whole body kinetic chain firing from his feet through his hips, through his shoulder, through his elbow, through his wrist, through his 2 extended knuckles into a point smaller than a silver dollar. The sound of impact was different from what anyone anticipated. Not a dull thud, not the sound of weight meeting weight. A crack, sharp and clean, like a tree branch failing under ice. Volkov moved. This was the thing nobody expected. Volkov moved. Not slightly. Not a controlled recovery. He moved the way a heavy door moves when something strikes it unexpectedly. A full, unplanned displacement of his entire body, stepping back not once but twice before his legs remembered their job and locked. The canvas mat shifted under his retreating feet. His arms, which had been hanging loose, shot out to the sides for a fraction of a second in the automatic gesture of a man trying to find his balance in a world that had just become briefly unreliable. He did not fall. He was 293 pounds and 14 years of conditioning, and he did not fall. But he had moved. That was the thing. Volkov, who had never moved backward from anything, had taken 2 involuntary steps. The room was completely silent for 3 seconds. Then everyone started talking at once. Petrov was writing so fast his handwriting became illegible, a fact he noted later with some embarrassment in the margin of his account. The other Soviet coaches and athletes were turning to each other with expressions that blended disbelief with something harder to name. The particular confusion of people whose framework for understanding something has just been damaged. Volkov stood there. He was touching the center of his chest with one massive hand, not pressing hard, just resting it there. His face showed an expression Bruce had seen before in other men who had never been truly hit. Not pain. Bewilderment. He looked down at his own chest as though checking whether what had just happened to him had left visible evidence. Mikhail, who had stopped breathing during the 5 seconds of the demonstration, now remembered to breathe. He looked at Bruce. Bruce was standing in exactly the same position he had been in before the strike. He hadn't moved his feet. He hadn't adjusted his stance. He had simply executed the technique and returned to stillness. Volkov said something. His voice was different from before. Mikhail translated carefully. He says, "I felt that in my back." He says, "Your fist was on my chest and I felt it in my back." He says, "That is not possible." Bruce answered, "It's not about the surface. The force travels through the surface. I wasn't trying to hit your chest. I was trying to hit something 12 inches behind your chest." Volkov processed this. It was not the kind of information his entire training philosophy had prepared him for. He understood force. He understood conditioning. He understood mass. He did not have a category for what had just happened to him. He looked at Bruce for a long time. Then he said something that Mikhail translated haltingly, pausing twice to make sure the English equivalents were correct. He says, "I have been hit by men who weigh 100 kilograms more than you. I have been hit by trained fighters with conditioned bodies and correct technique. I have never felt anything like that." He asks, "How is the force so concentrated?" Bruce thought about this. He had explained it many times to students, many times to researchers, many times to skeptical martial artists. But he chose his words for Volkov specifically, for a man who understood power from the inside out. "Your mass creates force in a line," Bruce said. "My mass creates force the same way. But my force is focused through a single point instead of distributed across the surface. A river and a needle can both penetrate. The needle goes through things the river cannot. Volkov was quiet. He turned to Petrov and spoke for a long time in Russian. Petrov answered, also at length. Then Volkov turned back to Bruce and Mikhail translated a question that took Petrov by surprise. Would you show me how to do it? It was not what anyone expected. The undefeated Siberian champion, the man who had declared before the meeting that he expected to find philosophy without application, was asking for instruction. Bruce agreed without hesitation. For the next 2 hours, in that cold concrete room in the academic city of a Siberian metropolis, where the temperature outside was killing any exposed water within seconds, Bruce Lee taught Alexe Volkov the fundamentals of whole-body force generation. Not just the one-inch punch, the principles beneath it, the kinetic chain. The way power begins at the heel and travels up through the body without interruption, each joint a relay station, the fist merely the terminus of a chain that had started at the floor. Volkov was an extraordinary physical specimen and a dedicated student when the material warranted his attention. He understood leverage from years of sambo. He understood hip rotation from throwing opponents. What Bruce showed him was how to integrate everything he already knew into a single unified expression of force. The technical understanding was there. It needed a different architecture. By the end of the session, Volkov could feel the difference between his old mechanics and the new integration. He could not replicate Bruce's output. Years of specifically refined training could not be compressed into 2 hours. But he understood, physically in his body, what had been done to him. He stood in front of the iron post he used for conditioning and hit it the way he had always hit it. Then he stood back and tried to apply what Bruce had shown him. The difference in sound was audible to everyone in the room. Dr. Petrov wrote 4 pages that night. Afterward, the group sat together in a side room where someone had brought hot tea in heavy ceramic mugs. The cold had crept through the walls over the course of the session, and everyone held their mugs with both hands. Volkov sat across from Bruce and spoke through Mikhail with the directness of a man who did not believe in wasting words. I came here thinking I would confirm what I already knew. He paused to drink. That small bodies with techniques are still small bodies. Bruce nodded. That is a reasonable position. It is what the physics suggests if you only count mass. But physics is more complicated than mass. Volkov said, I know that now, from inside my chest. What I could not account for, Bruce continued, is that you absorbed the strike the way you did. You moved, yes, but a smaller man would have gone down. Your conditioning is genuine. Your mass is genuine. I would not want to fight you in any context where you could establish your grip, because then it becomes your physics again. Volkov found this honest assessment more interesting than any compliment would have been. You're saying there are situations where you would lose to me. I am saying there are situations where everyone loses to everyone, Bruce said. My goal is never to be in those situations. Avoidance is a technique too. Volkov thought about this for a long time. Then he said something that Mikhail translated slowly, making sure each word survived the crossing from Russian to English. Where I come from, we say a mountain does not move for wind. He stopped. But if the wind knows where to push, even a mountain shifts. Bruce Lee left Novosibirsk the following morning. The temperature had dropped another 2 degrees overnight. At the airport, Volkov was there. He had driven 40 minutes in that cold, which in Siberia means something different than it means anywhere else. He extended his hand. Bruce shook it. The size difference was enormous, the way it always was with Volkov. But the handshake was between equals, which is a category that transcends size. Volkov said one thing before Bruce walked to the gate. Mikhail translated, Tell your students that the cold does not make you weak. It makes you honest. There is nowhere to hide in this temperature. Everything is exactly what it is. Dr. Petrov's account of the Novosibirsk session was classified for 11 years as part of a Soviet sports science research file. When the file was declassified in 1982, it became one of the most cited documents in the history of Soviet combat training, not because of what it said about Bruce Lee, but because of what it said about force generation principles that Soviet researchers had been trying to formalize for a decade. Petrov wrote in his conclusion, We came seeking to understand a mystery. We found instead a principle. The mystery was how 140 pounds could move 293 pounds. The principle is that mass is not the measure of force. Path is the measure of force. Volkov continued competing for 3 more years, retiring in 1974 with his record intact. He never spoke publicly about the Novosibirsk meeting during the Soviet period. In interviews given after 1991, following the dissolution of the USSR, he mentioned it twice. Both times he said the same thing. I invited a man to hit me because I was certain nothing would happen. He is the only man who has ever moved me. Not because he was strong, because he knew where the force belonged. Bruce incorporated the Siberian encounter into his teaching not as a story of victory, but as a study in the difference between static strength and dynamic force. He told his students about Volkov with genuine respect, noting that the big man's conditioning had prevented what might have been a significant injury from an impact that would have collapsed a smaller person. He said, "His body is extraordinary. I am glad I didn't have to fight him. I was glad to teach him instead. That was a better outcome than either of us expected." Novosibirsk, January 1971. -71 degrees outside. Two men from opposite ends of every physical spectrum. One raised on Siberian cold and iron conditioning and the simple certainty that mass decides outcomes. One raised on Wing Chun centerline theory and the idea that force without wisdom is a river without banks. 5 seconds of contact between them. 2 involuntary steps backward from a man who had never taken one before. A principle written in a Soviet notebook and classified for 11 years, and a handshake at an airport in the coldest inhabited city on Earth between 2 men who understood each other because they had each felt something true about the other. That is not a legend. That is physics meeting philosophy in the one place on Earth cold enough to strip everything down to what is real.